with forest fires covering an area about the size of the state of Rhode Island. Other western states, including Oregon, Montana, and Colorado, were ablaze with unprecedented damaging wildfires. At the same time, other parts of our country were being battered by violent extreme weather. The people of Iowa experienced one of the most costly thunderstorms in history. Hurricane-force winds caused $7.5 billion in economic damage and flattened, I'm told, over half of that state's corn and soybean crops in one day. Coastal towns in southern states like Florida, like Louisiana, like South Carolina were battered by hurricane after hurricane after hurricane. In the summer of 2020, last summer, we saw the most hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean in recorded history. Despite all of this, the Trump administration took a step to undo one of the key tools available to us to combat methane emissions that contribute greatly to climate change. The methane rescission rule was a stark departure from the widely accepted, science-based, and common sense view that we should protect people and our planet from the dangers of methane. In promulgating the methane rescission rule, the Trump administration ignored the global scientific community, including EPA's own agency scientists, who warned that the extreme weather events of 2020 were just the tip of the iceberg of consequences we can expect if we don't keep global warming below an increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius between now and 2040. The bottom line is that the Trump methane rescission rule would allow more methane pollution, increase public health dangers, and bring us ever closer to the brink of irreversible climate catastrophe. It is a Trump EPA action that my colleagues and I reject today through the resolution before us. The methane rescission rule stated methane couldn't be regulated under the Clean Air Act. We reject that. The methane rescission rule stated EPA couldn't regulate the entire oil and gas sector from wellhead to storage. We reject that. The methane rescission rule stated greenhouse gases couldn't be regulated. We reject that. The methane rescission rule also reversed EPA's longstanding position on what is required to regulate a pollutant, making it harder for EPA to implement clean air and climate protections. We reject that as well. With approval of this resolution, though, EPA can and should still move forward to strengthen methane standards for the oil and gas sector in the future. This effort is also very timely, coming on the heels of President Biden's climate commitment for our nation to reduce emissions by 50% from 2005 levels by the end of this decade, by 2030. Passing this resolution will be good for our health. Passing this resolution will be good for our planet, and passing this resolution will be good for America's economy. And that's why so many states, so many environmental groups, and even a number of significant oil and gas companies support this resolution. Joining over 60 environmental groups, as well as 20 states' attorney general, 7 major oil and gas companies support today's resolution to reinstate requirements to control methane emissions. From the Environmental Defense Fund to Shell, from the League of Conservation Voters to BP, from the Natural Resources Defense Council to Equinor, there's a broad consensus among the stakeholders with different interests, that Congress should reject and nullify the methane rescission rule. So why do a number of oil and gas companies want Congress to reject the Trump rule, restore existing regulations, and pursue further regulations? They know the best way to boost growth in their sector and across the economy is to keep methane and other climate pollution in check. With unchecked methane releases in its operations, natural gas production and use become part of the climate problem, not a part of the solution. as we endeavor to drive toward lower carbon fuels. Companies know where the global market is heading. They know regulations will support innovation and technology deployment in their industry, bringing down emission reduction costs for everyone. I sometimes like to quote Albert Einstein, who said, among other things, this. He said, in adversity lies opportunity. Think about that. In adversity lies opportunity. We can see that in the issue of methane pollution and climate change. It presents plenty of challenges, yes, that's true, but it also presents a remarkable opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to protect our planet, improve the air that we breathe, and strengthen our economy. At the same time, the product that the oil and gas industry is capturing can be sold to fuel more homes and businesses across the country. I want to say that again, too. At the same time, the product that the oil and gas industry is capturing can be sold to fuel more homes and businesses across the country. That's why today I will gladly vote for this resolution, which reaffirms that the Clean Air Act requires EPA to take action to protect Americans from dangerous pollution like methane. In passing this resolution today, Congress is rejecting the Trump rule baseless interpretation of the Clean Air Act, and in its place, reinstating common sense, methane, public health, and climate protections across the entire oil and gas sector. We're also clearing a path for additional protections from methane and other hazardous climate pollutants. As a Senate, we're making our intent clearer. The Clean Air Act gives EPA the authority and the mandate to establish methane emission standards, even stronger than the ones that we reinstate with this resolution. This includes all facets of the oil and gas industry now and moving forward, from production to processing and from transmission to storage. We're saying to EPA loud and clear, it is your mission to protect the environment, to protect human health and public welfare from the dangers of climate pollutants like methane. And there's a lot of work still to do before that mission can be achieved. It's time that we get to that work. We don't have a lot of time to waste. And Mr. President, I have a couple of unanimous consent requests I'd like to offer. One is to place supportive materials into the record. And I ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, to enter into the record several materials in support of Senate Joint Resolution 14 that's before us today. First, the Biden administration's statement of administration policy supporting passage of the resolution. Second, 2 letters of support for passing this joint resolution, one from the 57 leading environmental and advocacy groups, and another, the Shell Oil Company. These letters demonstrate the breadth of support for regulating this harmful pollutant and rejecting the methane precision rule. And I ask unanimous consent that these be inserted into the record as appropriate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I got to yield the floor, but before I do, I want to salute you for your role in an earlier day, in an earlier place, your state of Colorado, for helping get this started. We're in your debt. Good work. God bless. And with that, I yield the floor. Wait.
Madam President.
The senator from Iowa.
Madam President, it's been nearly 100 days since President Biden delivered his inaugural address, promising our nation unity, not division. He called on all of us to listen to one another, noting that unity requires more than words. I was there and I was listening. I was hopeful that he actually meant what he said. But that very same day, as soon as he reached the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, President Biden seemed to forget his own words as he began signing a record number of executive orders. With the stroke of a pen, he unilaterally created a new migrant crisis by reversing the previous administration's successful policies and ceasing construction of the wall. He also killed thousands of jobs for American workers by canceling the XL pipeline. And that was just his first day on the job. Since then, the president and his Democratic allies in Congress have used a partisan process to fast-track trillions of dollars of new spending for their pricey pet projects. Despite the president's call for us to listen to one another, the Democrats are planning to once again fast-track another $2.2 trillion package being sold as an infrastructure bill, even though it spends less on roads and bridges than it does on parts of the socialist Green New Deal and other progressive priorities. And then right after that, they want to ram through another $1 trillion for so-called human infrastructure. The Democrats are threatening to end the right of senators to debate by abolishing the filibuster so they can shove through their extreme agenda. This would fundamentally change the Senate, which has long been known as the world's, not just America's, but the world's greatest deliberative body, in which every state has equal representation and every senator is given a voice in our national conversations. It's an interesting twist for the party that just a year ago proudly resisted nearly every effort put forth to address the problems facing our nation. For purely partisan political reasons, Democrats even filibustered, yes, they filibustered, the Justice Act that would have provided police reform following the deaths of George Floyd and others. This week, the nation will have the opportunity to hear from the author of that bill, my dear friend, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, who is delivering the Republican response to the president's address this evening. No one better represents the type of positive leadership we need to unify our nation than Tim. He truly is the perfect voice for the American dream. Growing up in a poor single-parent household, Tim's mother worked hard to make ends meet. Despite some early challenges and setbacks, Tim successfully started his own business and was chosen time and again to serve in public office. As a senator, Tim is focused on creating opportunities for others by tapping into the potential of individuals and communities. Tim listens and he works hard to bring people together. And folks, that is what President Biden promised to do, but he's not living up to that promise. Frankly, the president only seems to be listening to the far left progressives within the Democratic Party who live on their own liberal fantasy island. He and his liberal allies on the left are pushing tax hikes on working Americans while giving tax breaks to wealthy coastal elites. They are bringing back corrupt and costly earmarks. Democrats want to defund our police and abolish ICE. They want to remake nearly every aspect of our economy with a radical Green New Deal. The Democrats are plotting to pack the Supreme Court with ultra-liberal justices and destroy that institution. And to pad their numbers in Congress, Democrats are attempting to make Washington, D.C. a state. Does that sound like the unity and bipartisanship we were promised on day one? It sure doesn't, folks. If President Biden actually listened to the voices of Americans who live outside of the DC swamp, he wouldn't be hearing a demand for any of those radical proposals. The Senate is split 50-50, while Democrats hold a razor slim majority in the House of Representatives. And according to a recent Gallup poll, an overwhelming 2/3 of Americans say they are dissatisfied with the way things are going in the United States. Based upon those responses, it sounds like the Democrats' radical agenda is dividing, not unifying our country. Iowans want Democrats and Republicans to set aside partisan differences and work together on our national interests. They want students to be able to safely return to their classroom and for folks to go back to work. Iowans want us to fix our roads and bridges and expand broadband to rural areas. They worry about the growing global influence of communist China and the humanitarian and national security crisis on our southern border. They want us to protect the American dream for future generations. Folks, we can do this. President Biden, if you are listening, please hear me out. Giving in to the deafening demands of the loudest on the left and attempting to silence half of the country will not solve our problems. It will only divide us more. To succeed, we need to consider the voices of all Americans and speak to what unites us so we can overcome our challenges. And we can overcome these challenges together. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Well, first, Madam President, I'd like to associate myself with the remarks of the senator from Iowa, who did a magnificent job of pointing out what we are facing as a nation. And I admire her fortitude and her hard work and her dedication as the vice chairman of the Republican Conference. Madam President, 99 days ago, Joe Biden took the oath of office. We were there. He gave an inaugural address. He said, quote, "With unity, we can do great things." He said, "Unity is the path forward." Well, that was the last example of unity and bipartisanship that we've seen from President Biden. He has lost all credibility when it comes to bipartisanship or unity. In just 99 days, President Biden has already shown himself to be one of the most radical presidents in American history. When I'm in Wyoming, as I am every weekend and have been over Easter as well, traveling the state, talking to people, they ask about two specific issues. One is energy, and the second is the southern border. On these two specific issues, Madam President, President Biden has already done tremendous damage. Damage to our country, damage to our people, damage to our economy. Right after his inaugural address about unity, President Biden drove to the White House, sat there, went in, and threw the unity speech out the window, and he drew a big target on the back of American energy, and he pulled the trigger. He shut down the Keystone XL pipeline. He ended new fossil fuel projects on federal lands, and he cut off traditional energy loans to developing nations that need our help and look to us for help. Well, these steps aren't going to reduce carbon emissions, but they will most certainly reduce jobs and wages from American energy workers. Also, on his first day, President Biden flipped on the big green light switch on our southern border. He sent out the word, laid out the welcome mat, and people from around the world came illegally to the United States. He stopped construction on the border wall, and he ended a policy that was successful, and the policy was that known as the Remain in Mexico policy. Now, the result wasn't just one crisis, it was two. It was a humanitarian crisis, and it was also a national security crisis. It's a national security crisis because 2/3 of the Border Patrol agents and I went to the border and went with a number of Republican senators and went on a midnight patrol with our border agents. And they told us that 2/3 of the Border Patrol agents are unable to do their jobs and keep us safe, unable to be there to enforce the law. And they said that so far, people have come into the country illegally from 56 different nations. The whole world knows the border is open. Our friends know it, our enemies know it, and this will make us less safe as a nation. There's also a humanitarian crisis at the border caused by President Biden. Just a month ago, a 9-year-old from Mexico died trying to cross the Rio Grande River. It's heartbreaking. That's what happens, though. This is what happens when more and more people try to come illegally to cross our border. Children who cross the border unaccompanied are sent to a facility that is prepared and appropriate for about 250 children. The day we were there were 7,000 crammed in like sardines. That is Joe Biden's plan for immigration. 10% of these children are testing positive for coronavirus. And we saw the testing process. And we know that every child there was exposed to coronavirus based on the high percentage of those who were testing positive. Now, as these young people are released, those that have tested negative but have just been exposed in the days before, they're being sent all across America. They're spreading the virus and unknown variants of the virus to this country. Joe Biden is the super spreader of coronavirus today. Democrats think this is just fine. Vice President of the United States is going to be up here tonight on Capitol Hill. She says we're making progress. Nancy Pelosi says we're on a good path on the border. Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas says the border is secure and closed, even though he has also said this is the worst case in 20 years for young people, and we are on a path for up to 2 million illegal immigrants coming across the border this year. White House refuses to use the word crisis. In fact, when the president and his press secretary have accidentally called it a crisis, and they both have done that, the White House issued a correction. They said, no, not a crisis, only a challenge. Madam President, who do they think they're fooling? 2 million illegal immigrants this year. It's not a challenge, it's a crisis. It is chaos at the border. It is catastrophic. 99 days ago, none of this was happening. For 99 days, Republicans in the United States Senate have repeatedly looked for common ground with President Biden and the Democrats. We've stood for American energy. We worked to secure the border. Yet for 99 days, those efforts have been blocked by President Biden and a Democrat majority, which is hardly a big majority when it's 50-50, which we would think would be a mandate to move to the middle. Well, President Biden still has 1,000 days or so left in his term. Tonight's speech might sound a lot like his inaugural address with lots of promises. The American people know talk is cheap. It's time for President Biden to start to practice what he is preaching. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to start by thanking my colleague from Wyoming and my colleague from Iowa for their comments about where we are as a country 100 days into the Biden administration. It's been discouraging that we haven't seen more bipartisan work. And with regard to the border, having been down there a couple of weeks ago, particularly discouraging that we can't come up with a bipartisan solution that deals with the obvious crisis on the border. Of course, it's a crisis. Everybody knows that, including the Biden administration. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And some of us have laid out some proposals that we think would be very sensible. It could be done on a bipartisan basis. And yet, we are not getting the kind of cooperation from the White House or the other side of the aisle, frankly, with regard to dealing with a clear crisis. In my time here in Congress, I've tried to work to bring Republicans and Democrats together on issues. I think that's the best thing for our country. I think you get actually better legislation if you have input from both sides. And I think you also have more sustainable legislation. If you don't work in a bipartisan way, what happens when there's a 50-50 Senate, as there is now, and where the vice president can supply the tie vote, and if you do things on the basis of reconciliation or getting rid of the filibuster, which is what the Democratic majority apparently would like to do, you end up lurching back and forth, don't you? So you pass Democrat legislation, and then when Republicans take over Republican legislation, we should be focusing on American legislation. In my office, we've had some success with this bipartisan approach. 68 of my bills were signed into law by President Obama. 82 of my bills were signed into law by President Trump on important issues like the addiction crisis, job creation, natural resource protection. So it can be done. And President Biden knows that. He served here in the Senate. In fact, he took pride in coming together with Republicans and Democrats to actually have agreements on some of these tough issues. And although I didn't vote for him because I thought that President Trump had better policy ideas, coming into this new administration, I was hopeful that President Biden would govern as he had campaigned. He promised, remember, in his campaign to reach out to Republicans and Democrats alike. He talked about the need for unity. In fact, he gave that same speech in the primary and in the general election, which I thought took some courage, frankly, to do so in the primary, because most of his opponents did not take that position. And yet now, having gotten elected, he seems to have forgotten the pledges that he made. I listened to his inaugural address intently, as I hope a lot of Americans did, and certainly my colleagues did, and he talked again about reaching out, going back to the days when we could work together, and he focused on unity. I was very hopeful with the tone he set that day, and I said so at the time. And yet, that rhetoric has not been matched by action. It hasn't been matched by action when it comes to key policy initiatives they've already put forward, including the latest COVID-19 spending bill that passed in March. Remember, despite a 50-50 Senate and very tight majority in the House of Representatives, there was no outreach to Republicans on the COVID-19 legislation. Not a single Republican was consulted before unveiling the plan, and once it was out there, Democrats chose to work only among themselves and do it under what's called reconciliation, where they don't need a single Republican vote. This is despite some of us having an alternative, which we actually presented to the White House. The next day we were told, thank you, but we're going to take the reconciliation approach, and we don't need any Republican input. That's too bad, because the COVID-19 issue obviously is one where there has been not just bipartisanship, but nonpartisanship. 5 times last year, we passed major COVID-19 legislative initiatives with huge majorities. In one case, the biggest bill, the CARES package, passed with a 97-0 vote here. So this is one where we had always been able to work together. Unfortunately, the Biden administration chose the partisan path. Right now, the Biden administration is repeating this same mistake, as far as I can tell, because they've introduced their $2.3 trillion infrastructure package without consulting, again, any Republicans. And we now hear that White House and some Democratic leaders may want to pass this latest partisan proposal by reconciliation as well. I hope that's not true, because again, this is an area, infrastructure, where we have been able to work together on a bipartisan basis and get things done. In fact, typically that's how it happens with infrastructure. Last Congress, we passed a bill out of the committee on highways and bridges with a unanimous vote, not just a majority vote, a unanimous vote by Republicans and Democrats. But the proposal they put forward, first, is not really about infrastructure, because it dramatically expands the definition of infrastructure so that it is not at all what traditionally you would think, or I would think of, as the kind of hard assets, roads, bridges, ports, airports, transit, even broadband, even the most generous description of infrastructure applied to this bill means that less than 20% of it, 20% of $2.3 trillion is about infrastructure. It's about other things, and we can have a debate on those other things, whether it's nursing home subsidies or whether it's subsidies to electric car companies or whether it's child care. Those are all issues we can discuss, but they're not obviously infrastructure issues. By proposing to pay for this huge plan with taxes on American workers makes it even worse. So the $2.3 trillion plan is not mostly infrastructure, 80% is not, but then the taxes that would apply to America and to American workers would be devastating, making us non-competitive in the global economy again after finally we were getting our act together. And in 2018 and 2019, we saw a big increase in our economy, large increases in terms of employment, but also wages were going up, the lowest poverty rate in the history of our country, going back to the 1950s, partly because we were putting in place policies that made sense in terms of tax reform to create more incentive to invest and bring jobs here to this country. That would all be changed under these tax increases that are being proposed to pay for this big new Biden infrastructure package. Making us less competitive in global markets and putting American workers at a disadvantage again is not the right way to go. The American people don't want that. American people think we should be doing all we can to get businesses back on their feet right now so people can get employment. And so we can ensure that the economy continues to improve as we come out of the coronavirus pandemic. Infrastructure, again, has always been so bipartisan. Why would, in this case, we want to take it down the partisan road? Past presidents, by the way, have shown that they can get big things done early in their administration. So during this first 100 days, there was an opportunity to reach out. I hope in the second 100 days that will be different. Let me give you a couple of examples. When President Bill Clinton got elected, he worked with Republicans and Democrats to pass what was called the North American Free Trade Agreement. He got a lot of support from the Republican side of the aisle. In fact, even more than he got from the Democratic side of the aisle, and he pushed that through. Ronald Reagan's economic reforms of 1981 passed the Senate with an overwhelming margin of 89-11. Last night, C-SPAN allowed us to look back in history at some of the speeches presidents gave after they were in their first 100 days, and one was Ronald Reagan's speech to the joint session that I saw last night. It was amazing. Republicans and Democrats alike were standing because President Reagan said, "I want to work with all of you." And he showed he would work with all of them by passing those economic reforms in 1981. We should all want the Biden administration to succeed in putting in place bipartisan policies that help our constituents and help our country. But that can only happen if they agree to reverse course and engage with Republicans in a genuine way. That's clearly what the American people want. In a recent poll, the Washington Post and ABC poll, 60% of respondents, including 2/3 of independents, said they wanted the Biden administration to work with Republicans to make his proposals bipartisan, twice the number that wanted him to pursue the partisan path chosen so far. I'd suggest to my constituents in Ohio and all Americans who'll be listening tonight, don't just listen to the rhetoric, look at the actions, because the rhetoric thus far has not been matched by actions. We were promised bipartisanship as a path toward unity. For the sake of our country, it's time to keep that promise. Yield back.
Madam President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to talk about how Congress can work together in a bipartisan way to pass infrastructure legislation, following my colleagues from Ohio, from Wyoming, from Iowa, colleague from North Carolina is here as well. There's a real desire to come up with an infrastructure package, but we want it to be bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats agree that investing in our national infrastructure is necessary to increase economic growth, ensure global competitiveness of American businesses, and create new high-paying jobs. In fact, just last Congress, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee unanimously approved a 5-year surface transportation reauthorization bill, which included about $300 billion for roads, bridges, and that actually represents a 27% increase over the FAST Act. And we really feel that that bill, with its bipartisan support, creates a starting point on a bipartisan basis for the negotiations that we should have in developing the infrastructure package. Tonight, we expect the president will outline his American Jobs Plan. But unfortunately, it's not focused on infrastructure. It's a massive $2.25 trillion tax and spend bill that dedicates less than 1/3, about just over 600 billion, toward actual traditional infrastructure. The administration's plan would increase the corporate tax from 21% to 28%, resulting in reduced wages, increased costs for consumers, and a reduction in economic growth. The Biden plan would revert the U.S. tax system to a worldwide tax system, increasing taxes on U.S. multinational corporations, reducing the competitiveness of American businesses, and driving U.S. jobs and profits to other countries. The 2017 tax bill brought the U.S. into a territorial tax system for the taxation of multinational companies. It's worked. From 1985 to 2017, 85 U.S.-based multinational corporations took advantage of corporate inversions, resulting in a $9.5 billion tax revenue loss to the U.S. government. Since the 2017 Jobs and Tax Cut Act, there have been no corporate inversions. The Biden plan would abandon this successful approach. Further, the administration has proposed a $35 billion tax increase on U.S. energy producers, endangering U.S. energy independence, costing U.S. jobs, and empowering foreign energy production. A recent study from the National Association of Manufacturers shows that nearly 1 million jobs would be lost in the first 2 years alone if this tax increase goes through. Tonight, we expect to hear from President Biden on additional proposals to increase taxes on American workers, as well as increase our debt and deficit. For instance, we've seen reports today that the president is going to seek to repeal stepped-up basis. Now, while the administration indicates there may be some exceptions, repealing stepped-up basis would place a significant and complex tax burden on small businesses, and particularly family farms, ranches, not only in my state of North Dakota, but across the country. Right now, the average age of our farmers in America is about 60 years old. And we need to get the next generation into farming, but they can't do it if they have to sell the farm to pay the tax. A repeal of stepped-up basis would increase the cost of capital, discourage investment, reduce the wages of workers, and stunt economic growth in both the immediate and long term. A recent analysis from Ernst & Young shows that eliminating stepped-up basis will result in the loss of 80,000 jobs a year for the next 10 years and a loss of nearly $10 billion in GDP growth per year. While we continue to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, we should not be constraining economic growth by increasing taxes and regulation. Instead, we should maintain the pro-growth low-tax regime put in place in 2017 by the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and make targeted investments in traditional infrastructure while reducing regulatory barriers to provide long-term certainty to Americans. Last week, I met with President Biden at the White House to share this very message, that Republicans stand ready to work with the administration and our Democrat colleagues on the infrastructure package in a bipartisan and targeted manner, focusing on updating our roads, bridges, railways, airports, broadband, and other traditional infrastructure. We also support investing in energy infrastructure, including enhancing the 45Q tax credit to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and sequestration technology, as well as pipelines to provide the safe and efficient transportation of our natural resources. We should be working together for the American people to enact policies that will improve our national infrastructure. To this end, I want to highlight a number of bipartisan proposals that I've been working on with my colleagues across the aisle. I've introduced bipartisan legislation with Senator Smith, Senator Capito, Senator Whitehouse, and others to enhance the 45Q tax credit for carbon capture and sequestration. Also, Senator Smith and I have legislation that would empower rural electric and telecom cooperatives to refinance existing debt, reinvest in improved energy efficiency, and expand broadband delivery to more of their rural customers. Likewise, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Wyden and I have introduced a bill that would encourage private investment in infrastructure by expanding private activity bonds and creating a new infrastructure tax credit. Additionally, I've introduced legislation with Senator Bennett that ensures that our farmers, ranchers, and producers have the regulatory flexibility needed to safely and efficiently move their products, livestock in particular, to market while ensuring the safety of all road users. We don't need to burden hardworking Americans with increased taxes in order to pay for this. There are a number of potential options to provide the necessary revenue for a targeted infrastructure package. For example, we can make modest changes to our user fee-based highway trust fund system, ensuring that electric vehicles pay into the fund. We can repurpose unused federal spending, including using funds from the recent American Rescue Plan Act. We could also use revenue generated from energy production on federal lands. And these are just a few of the ideas we put forward. Last week, Ranking Member Capito of the Environment and Public Works Committee, along with ranking members of Banking, Commerce, Energy, and Finance Committees on the framework of a almost $600 billion infrastructure package, which focuses investment in traditional infrastructure. We should use this framework and begin working through regular order in a committee-driven process to produce a bipartisan, targeted infrastructure bill that does not increase taxes on American workers. That way, we truly upgrade our infrastructure, create jobs, and keep our economy growing. Madam President, that's the right approach. And we need to work in a bipartisan manner to get it done. And with that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Yes, Senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to thank my colleague from North Dakota and Ohio and Wyoming and Iowa have spoken before me, and my colleague from Kansas after me. I think Senator Portman ended his statement by saying, we've heard the rhetoric, but we haven't seen the actions. Well, in North Carolina, our state motto in Latin is esse quam videre. It means to be rather than to seem. And I think our state model does a good job of summarizing the first 100 days of the Biden administration. As a presidential candidate, Joe Biden made it seem he would govern as a moderate, pragmatic deal maker. And he set the bar high in his inaugural address. He said, my whole soul is in this, bringing America together, uniting our people, and uniting our nation. I ask every American to join me in this cause. I was actually inspired by that statement, and I'm one of the Americans who was willing to work for him on that cause. In fact, I was one of 10 Republicans that had the first official meeting with the president to see if we could come to common ground on the COVID relief package after having successfully passed 5 bipartisan COVID relief packages last Congress. Unfortunately, the president's actions have not corresponded with his promises to date. Instead of leading on his instincts to bring America together, President Biden has followed his advisors' recommendations to go it alone. He's pushed a highly partisan, ideologically driven agenda. And you don't need to take my word for it. New York Representative Ocasio-Cortez recently declared that President Biden has exceeded the expectations of progressives. Indeed, there's been a lot in Biden's agenda for the left to like. It's an agenda designed to pass with no need for moderation and not a single Republican vote. No consensus whatsoever. Proposing tax hikes on American families and businesses at a time that they're trying to rebound from the pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, we're in the middle of a national emergency. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We have spent and appropriated billions of dollars to healthcare, to businesses to recover. And now, long before the pandemic's been declared, or the emergency, national emergency's been declared done, we're talking about taking those same dollars away. Offering mixed messaging and failed policies that have caused a humanitarian and security crisis at the southern border is another issue. When I went down to the border about a month ago, the press secretary said it's not a crisis, it's a situation. Now, a month later, the press secretary and the administration says it's a crisis, but now it's a catastrophe. I saw a dead body floating in the Rio Grande River. Other people have died. We heard the report of the 9-year-old. That doesn't even count the number of people who die along the way. It also doesn't count the 300 or 400 people who are called the gotaways. Not the thousands who are coming in and going to the border agents, but the hundreds every night who are crossing. They're bad actors, they're many of them are gang members, or they're smuggling drugs, human traffickers that are evading arrest. It's creating a dangerous situation. It's a catastrophe. The president hasn't spoken on it. To my knowledge, the vice president's never gone down there to actually get a bird's eye view. The president's embraced the Green New Deal policies like canceling the Keystone Pipeline. That one stroke of a pen ended thousands of labor union jobs, good paying jobs. But even more heartbreaking is that the communities that would have benefited from all of that commerce occurring in some of the most rural areas and most economically challenged areas in our country. They rammed through an entirely partisan $2 trillion spending package. They called it COVID relief, but only about 9% of it actually had anything to do with continuing to recover from the damage that COVID has caused this country. And now, I'm sure the president will talk about it tonight, a $2.3 trillion, air quotes, infrastructure bill that isn't actually an infrastructure bill. In fact, they've been a little bit more intellectually honest. Now they're calling it human infrastructure. Well, I think most Americans, when you think about infrastructure, you think about roads, you think about bridges, you think about broadband. You don't think about human infrastructure. But that's what's being pitched today, and it's being pitched on a partisan basis without even attempting to get a single Republican vote. Americans did not elect President Biden to enact any of these partisan policies. They trusted him to come in and make deals, to settle for something less than 100%, but something that was going to be embraced by more of the American people versus half, which is about where the president is today. And he's pursued this for the first 100 days. I hope he changes his mind. But here's one reason why I'm not optimistic. His most audacious action, in my opinion, is placating the far left and entertaining the idea of nuking the Senate legislative filibuster. In this very chamber, 21 years ago, then Senator Biden declared that defending the filibuster was about defending compromise and moderation. The promises he made on the campaign trail, the promise he made on the day of his inauguration. He noted that his speech was one of the most important he would ever give as senator, defending the filibuster. It's a shame that President Biden isn't demonstrating the same political courage that Senator Biden did 2 decades earlier. The kind of courage that we're seeing today demonstrated by Senators Manchin and Senator Sinema. Instead, the president has entertained the far left's push to eliminate the filibuster and destroy this institution. To end bipartisanship and compromise is really no longer a necessity, so that any piece of fringe legislation can pass with a simple majority. The president, a 30-plus year defender of the filibuster, should know better than anyone. He knows that the left is demanding a Faustian bargain, trading 2 years for the far left to have free rein in exchange for permanent destabilization of our republic, emboldening future demagogues on both ends of the spectrum. Our country doesn't need more partisan pandering or political brinksmanship from this administration or from either party. That's why I stood against nuking the filibuster about 3 years ago, and I will as long as I'm a U.S. Senator. There are plenty of Republicans like me who are willing to work with President Biden and even put some of our supporters out of their comfort zone for the good of this nation. In fact, when I was sworn in, I said I'd work to find common ground in areas where we may agree, and I'd vigorously oppose policies where we do not. Unfortunately, to this point, I've only had the opportunity to do the latter. The willingness to negotiate has only been a one-way street on the part of Republicans. I went to the White House to try and find common ground on another bipartisan COVID package. But it's ultimately up to the president whether he leads on bipartisanship instincts or follows his advisors who are pushing him to keep governing from the left. Quite frankly, it doesn't matter what the president says about bipartisanship and uniting the country, it's what he does. And tonight, I hope we'll see it for the good of our great nation. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
The senator from Kansas.
Thank you, Madam President. On January the 20th, President Joe Biden gave his inaugural address to the American people, saying that in order to overcome the challenges we face as a nation and to, I quote, to restore the soul and to secure the future of America requires more than words. It requires that most elusive of things in a democracy, unity, unity. I end the quotes, and he says for a second time, unity. In fact, he mentioned the word unity 9 separate times throughout his inaugural remarks. Unfortunately, that unity President Biden preached about is nowhere to be found. 100 days in office, and there's been zero bipartisanship from the White House on any major issue. We've seen zero effort by the White House to take any Republican idea or concept seriously. In fact, they've done very little to reach across the aisle, engage Republicans, or have a serious conversation with us. They've shown that they are not interested in bipartisanship as they continue to jam through their radical agenda and seek power grab after power grab. We've seen a record number of executive orders, the first partisan COVID relief bill, steps to grant DC statehood to tip the powers of scale, a directive that threatens private property rights, the cornerstone of our democracy, an attempt to federalize elections and destroy election integrity with H.R. 1, threats to eliminate the filibuster, increased gas prices for Americans at the pump, efforts to pack the Supreme Court, disguised measures to pass the Green New Deal, calls to defund the police, mandates to allow biological boys to compete in girls' sports, and tax increases on all Americans, and much, much more. Madam President, things are changing in D.C. History will record President Biden as having spent more money than any other president in U.S. history in his first 100 days. I'm warning everyone, grab your wallets. And history will record President Biden's misguided policies as making our nation less safe, having created a health crisis, a national security crisis, and a humanitarian crisis at the southern border. What I hope and fear from President Biden this evening is not likely to be covered in a speech. He's going to try to explain to us, even though our economy is recovering and we just borrowed and spent $2 trillion from our grandchildren, why we now need to spend another $2 trillion and why he needs to raise your taxes to do it. He's going to try to describe the legislation he wants passed as a so-called infrastructure bill, when less than 5% of it is going towards roads and bridges. He's trying to convince Americans of something that is a misnomer and not a truth. What he won't tell you is that this is a recipe to kill Kansas jobs and an economic catastrophe for this nation. Last week, President Biden signed into law a bipartisan bill I introduced alongside Senators Bill Cassidy and Tina Smith to lower prescription drug prices for the American people. Additionally, we unanimously passed a bill out of the Ag Committee regarding carbon markets. These are both great examples of the unity the president spoke of in his inaugural address. Democrats and Republicans coming together to deliver solutions for the American people. These are good first steps, and in case there is more opportunity for bipartisanship, let me tell you where we can and should start. We can start with an infrastructure package that actually rebuilds our aging roads, bridges, and waterways, invest in future generations, ensures high-speed internet for all Americans, and incentivizes innovation. We can start with staying the course laid out by Operation Warp Speed and getting more shots in people's arms so we can reach herd immunity sooner rather than later. We can start with people getting back to work and finally unleash our economy to pre-pandemic levels. And we can start with getting all our kids back in school. As President Biden said in his inaugural address, and I quote again, "This is our historic moment of crisis and challenge, and unity is the path forward," end quotes. If he truly puts unity above all else, we can accomplish great things for the American people. For it is unity that will see this country come roaring back, not President Biden's radical partisan ways that have further divided this nation. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Senator from Arkansas.
sadly, the United States is in the midst of the deadliest drug epidemic in our nation's history, caused by some of the deadliest drugs ever created. It appears that more than 80,000 Americans died from a drug overdose last year. By far the biggest killers were lab-made opioids, such as fentanyl, which are cheap to produce and easy to mix with other street drugs, such as heroin. These lethal cocktails have devastated countless communities and families across our nation. Too many parents have come home to a dead child who mistakenly took a prescription pill or a so-called party drug laced with this deadly fentanyl. Illicit fentanyl, the kind created in underground Chinese drug labs or smuggled across our porous southern border by Mexican cartels, is made only to addict and kill. For these dark, terrible purposes, fentanyl is unsurpassed in the tragic history of addiction. It is 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. Just 2 milligrams of fentanyl, the amount equivalent to a few grains of salt, is enough to kill a grown man. Just last December, police arrested a man in Arkansas carrying 7 pounds of fentanyl. Depending on the purity of that fentanyl, that would have been enough to deliver a fatal dose to up to 1.5 million Americans. And that's far from the biggest fentanyl bust that police have ever made. That means that every time our Border Patrol stops a drug mule coming across our southern border, every time the Coast Guard intercepts a drug runner's vessel in our waters, and every time a SWAT team raids a drug as Schedule I prohibited substances. This decision closed a deadly loophole that drug dealers were using to escape punishment for poisoning our citizens, while still allowing legitimate researchers to apply for and obtain approval to research these analogs for potential medical or scientific breakthroughs. The evidence suggests that this law enforcement action has been getting results. Since the class-wide scheduling went into effect in early 2018, law enforcement encounters with uncontrolled fentanyl analogs plummeted by almost 90%. Of course, our work to solve the opioid epidemic is far from finished. We still have much to do to dismantle the cartels and the drug trafficking networks that spread fentanyl and its analogs and mix it with other drugs. But the DEA's efforts to control fentanyl analogs were a step in the right direction. Last year, the Senate voted unanimously to extend the DEA's emergency scheduling of fentanyl. But that extension is now set to expire. So we have the opportunity, in fact, I would say we have the responsibility to permanently control these deadly fentanyl analogs. So law enforcement has the legal backup it needs to take these dangerous drugs off the streets. If Congress doesn't act, this emergency scheduling order is set to expire next week. The authority of our Border Patrol to seize these drugs as they cross the border will be dramatically reduced. Cartels will once again be able to exploit loopholes to evade prosecution, and Chinese super labs will get right back to work, inventing new and creative ways to repackage fentanyl and to kill even more Americans. We cannot let that happen. I've introduced a bill to solve this problem once and for all by merely eliminating the expiration date on the law that protects us against these fentanyl analogs. I'm asking my colleagues to approve it just like we did last year, unanimously. I'd also like to urge my Democratic colleagues to disregard the liberal activist groups that are lobbying against controlling these deadly fentanyl analogs because they hope to use it as a bargaining chip to reduce criminal penalties for the most serious drug traffickers. Think about that. More Americans died of a drug overdose last year than in any other year in our history, yet these liberal activists are trying to help the drug traffickers who spread these very poisons. If they succeed, drug dealers will have an easier time killing Americans for profit, and prosecutors will have to waste valuable resources proving that each new form of fentanyl they encounter is in fact a deadly drug. We cannot play politics with this bill. Trading the lives of innocent Americans for more lenient treatment for cartels and super labs. Protecting Americans from deadly fentanyl should not be treated as a bargaining piece or poker chip. I ask my colleagues to think of the victims and to think of the urgency of this measure. I'm offering this bill on behalf of tens of thousands of Americans who were with us just last year, but are not today because of these deadly synthetic drugs. And I'm offering it on behalf of the countless Americans who can still be saved if we act. So I urge my colleagues to support this measure, and therefore, Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to immediate consideration of S1410, introduced earlier today. Further, I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from New Jersey.
I'm deeply grateful for my colleague and my friend from Arkansas to bring this to the floor of the United States Senate. There is an urgency that he described that I agree with. 100 senators here, not one state has not been touched devastatingly by the fentanyl epidemic, and these analogs present a crisis to our country. Lives are at stake. And so I share his sense of urgency. I am hoping that we can work together to find a way to stop, as he put it, these cartels and these drug labs from wreaking such havoc in our country. I believe that together we can find a solution. In fact, there has been constructive talk across the Capitol, bipartisan talk about finding a way to come to some kind of accord. In addition to that, I'm hopeful that there are other bills out there that have the same ambition, the same goal, the same sense of urgency that I believe should be part of the discussion. For example, policies like the ones in the Stop Fentanyl Act, which I understand Senator Markey will be introducing in the Senate very soon. I believe that we should have time in the Judiciary Committee to work on a longer-term solution that could not just deal with the international cartels, not just deal with these horrific drug labs, but also empower people who are addicted to begin not to be punished simply with the criminal justice system, but to find ways to provide treatment and support to people who are struggling with addictions to this horrific drug. So with that, I would like to object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President,
The junior senator from Arkansas.
I thank my colleague from New Jersey for those remarks. I do hope that we can find a solution, but time is not on our side. This emergency scheduling order expires next week. The Senate's not in session next week. I know that we want to empower addicts, as the senator from New Jersey said, that we want to help get them treatment that they need to get back on their feet. That's a goal I share. We are talking, though, about drug dealers, drug traffickers, cartels, Chinese super labs. And if we do not pass an extension, in my bill, a permanent extension of this emergency scheduling order, it is the addicts who will be hurt because their drug dealers and these cartels and the super labs will simply begin to flood our streets once again with these synthetic fentanyl analogs, which I remind you again, can be 150 times more potent than fentanyl itself, which is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. So I hope my Democratic friends will reconsider in the short time we have this week, and we'll be able to pass a permanent extension of this scheduling order. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The junior senator from New Jersey.
I just want to say in conclusion, before I switch to another topic, I appreciate the senator from Arkansas's willingness to look not just at his bill, but also the power of a potential bipartisan extension or however we can deal with this, because the urgency does exist. We are in a crisis. But I rise today to speak in support of Ambassador Power's nomination to serve as administrator for the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. Now, the mission of USAID is to advance the values of democracy throughout the world on behalf of the American people. This mission has never been more critical than today. And if confirmed, Ambassador Power will lead an agency tasked with responding not only to the global crisis of COVID-19 and its devastating impact on vulnerable people across the world, but some of the most pressing challenges facing the United States and the international community. Global democratic backsliding, human suffering caused by sexual and gender-based violence, climate change, and violent conflict around the world. Now, Ambassador Power is an extraordinary public servant. She has distinguished herself in her career, and she is more than capable of leading USAID's efforts to address these global urgencies. And she is clear-eyed and sober about the international challenges she will face, USAID will face as well. Over the past 4 years, experts and career professionals within the USAID were unfortunately silenced. Decisions were politicized, and recruitment and retention were inadequate. Ambassador Power will be the kind of leader this agency now needs to restore integrity, transparency, rebuild morale among the dedicated professionals who drive USAID's critical mission. Ambassador Power also understands that the U.S. will remain a global leader, really must remain a global leader, able to counter the influence of China's aggressive diplomatic and development agenda. If USAID is seen once and again by our international partners, this mission of countering China will be stronger. If USAID is seen as a competent and trustworthy partner, we will build along our coalitions to counter China's aggressive actions. President Biden could not have nominated someone more ready, more capable than Ambassador Power. She has had an impressive career, and she has, from her work as a Pulitzer Prize writing journalist to spending 8 years in the Obama administration and the National Security Council, and then as ambassador to the United Nations, where she championed the rights of women, atrocity prevention, LGBTQ rights, receiving consensus with other countries on vital U.S. interests, while going toe-to-toe with our adversaries. This is one of our more experienced international diplomats from America that we have today. And by elevating Ambassador Powell to the National Security Council, President Biden has made it clear that development and humanitarian assistance will be an integral component to our meeting our foreign policy objectives. That is important, that we understand that development and humanitarian assistance are a critical part of our foreign policy. And so finally, I just want to end with something that Ambassador Power shared in her most recent book. It's something that I think speaks so well to her humility, to her willingness to learn, and to why she will be the leader of the USAID, and I say our entire nation and the world needs right now. Ambassador Power wrote about a meeting she had with the ambassador from the Central African Republic, Charles Dubin, who described to her the horrific violence taking place in his country. She wrote about during that meeting that she told him she didn't have an agenda. She just wanted to learn from him about what was happening in her country. She then writes that he started speaking and then stops and gets very emotional. And she assumes he is getting emotional about the horrific violence in his country, but he says to her, and I quote, "No, it's not that, Ambassador. What is happening in my country is terrible, more terrible than anything that has ever happened to us before. But I am emotional because you are here. The United States of America is the greatest country in the world, and you, America, are here." That is the vision of America that has defined Ambassador Power's career, that has guided her. The awesome responsibility of representing this nation and her values, her rootedness in the ideals of our nation, humility, grace, compassion, thoughtful leadership. I've known Ambassador Powell since she and I were very young. It's been decades now of friendship and connection. You could say many things about her, but at her core is decency and honor. She will represent the best of us. She is exactly the leader we need right now as we navigate increasing and pressing challenges facing the world and our country. I am thankful. It'd be enough for Ambassador Powell to retire. It'd be enough for her to say, "I have served my country," and like Cincinnatus, return to her plow. But clearly, her calling is not yet fully been answered. She will continue, should this body believe it and endorse it, to serve this country. She will continue to honor the United States of America. She will continue to be a credit to our nation and the world. And that is why I urge my colleagues to support her nomination. I yield the floor.
The senior senator from Iowa.
I'm 5 minutes late coming to the Senate floor. I was supposed to be here on the fentanyl issue to support Senator Cotton. And I know that the objection's been raised, but I want people to know how important I think this issue is. So today we were considering, hopefully unanimous consent, to pass a Schedule fentanyl substance bill. Proactively scheduling fentanyl related substances ought to be a big priority because too many Americans' lives have been lost to reject this critical measure. Some wrongly assert that controlling fentanyl analogs is partisan and unnecessary. That's simply untrue. Legislation to schedule fentanyl analogs is a bipartisan issue. Just last year, this body passed a bipartisan 15-month extension of the bill unanimously. Also, such authority is necessary. The CDC estimates that fentanyl analogs killed 50,000 Americans in the last 12 months. We must prevent overdose deaths. Prevention is possible when we use our laws to force China to stop the flow of fentanyl analogs. Opponents of permanent scheduling assert that the authority is broad and could result in too many arrests. But since the Drug Enforcement Administration placed fentanyl analogs in Schedule 1, the Justice Department has convicted only 80 people under that authority. So too many people being arrested as an argument against permanent extension is hogwash. This authority hasn't resulted in vast and wide prosecutions. Rather, this authority is targeted and deliberate, and of course, that's the way it should be. So if controlling fentanyl analogs is in fact bipartisan and necessary, why isn't supporting legislation then a no-brainer? Perhaps because of heightened partisanship. Democrats can't vote for legislation that helps law enforcement. Or maybe they can't be seen as supporting any drug control law, even if it helps law enforcement. Or maybe they can't be seen as supporting any drug control law, even if it could save thousands of lives. This position goes against the unfortunate truth that 50,000 Americans have died from these deadly fentanyl analogs. Politics has no place above human life. As frustrated as I am by this, it's not my nature to throw in the towel. I'll always work hard to find middle ground. That's why I'm asking every senator to support Senator Cotton's permanent extension, or at a minimum, my bill, the Temporary Extension of Fentanyl Scheduling Act. This bipartisan measure extends the authority to schedule fentanyl analogs for 14 months. It keeps fentanyl analogs in Schedule 1 until July 2022, which is long enough for the administration to come to a permanent scheduling solution and allow for a deliberate and transparent dialogue with Congress. So, simply put, we need to give ourselves enough time to find a solution to this major problem causing 50,000 lives to be lost every year. As history shows us, lengthy fentanyl scheduling legislation is not controversial. I'm simply asking for a similar bipartisan approach now. My bill is the only bipartisan temporary extension bill on the table. I'm grateful for Senator Hassan and Shaheen for teaming up with me and Senator Cornyn. We can't limit ourselves in the fight against fentanyl. It's with this in mind that I urge all my colleagues to support either a permanent extension or my bipartisan bill, and to extend the authority to schedule fentanyl analogs for 14 months. I yield the floor.
The junior senator from Florida.
Madam President, Americans are worried about inflation. New polling shows that 87% of Americans are concerned about the rising cost of household items like diapers, gas, and groceries. That's up from 77% just last month. And they have good reason to feel that way. Right now, reports show that a third of American households making less than $50,000 in annual income are buying less because of increasing prices. And more than 1/4 of all households report that rising prices on goods are causing them to purchase less. Just last month, or this month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that over the last 12 months, food prices are up and gas prices have risen 23%. That means since Biden was elected, gas prices have increased about 70 cents per gallon across the nation. Year over year, consumer prices increased 2.6% in March. That's up from an annual 1.7% increase in February. This is all in addition to statements from some of America's largest corporations, like Procter & Gamble and Kimberly-Clark, which recently announced that they are increasing prices on a number of their products. That includes essential household goods like toilet paper and diapers.
The evidence of inflation is right in front of us. Just look at these numbers, which show the percentage change in average unit prices versus last year. Groceries up 2.6%, household goods up 5.2%, baby care up 7%, general merchandise up 7.1%. Wages never go up as this fast. So who's it hurt? The poorest and those on fixed income. Businesses are expecting prices increases to continue. According to data from FactSet, 47 S&P companies have mentioned inflation on their earnings calls for Q1 2021. That is more than during any quarter in the last 10 years. On their most recent earnings call, Procter & Gamble Chief Financial Officer Andre Schulten said, "The commodity cost challenge we face this year will obviously be larger next fiscal year." And who gets hurt the most when their inflation rises? Not the rich, it's working families, especially those on low and fixed incomes. I grew up poor and watched my parents struggle to put food on the table. I know just how much a slight rise in prices can hurt a family because I saw it growing up. And that is what is happening right now across our nation. We know that the Biden administration is worried about this. They know that rising costs caused by their massive spending are bad for Americans, but they won't say it. While they are reportedly worrying in private about the effects of their spending plans, they've had a different message in public. On April 13th, the New York Times reported that officials and aides at the White House and the Department of Treasury have been holding private meetings for months to discuss inflation and conducted in-depth internal analysis for senior officials and President Biden. The article goes on to say, quote, "Mr. Biden's aides are sufficiently worried about the risk of spending fueling inflation that they shaped his infrastructure proposal, which is yet to be taken up by Congress, to fund out $2.3 trillion over 8 years, which is slower than traditional stimulus." Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that this article be placed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, the content and conclusions of these meetings and working groups have not been disclosed or made available to the public. While privately worrying about the same issue I've been sounding the alarm on for months, the Biden administration continues to mislead the American public and ignore the threat of inflation. Over the last 2 months, I've asked the National Economic Council about their plans to fight inflation and protect American families. I've written to Federal Reserve members asking what can be done to help families who are seeing skyrocketing gas prices and increasing mortgage rates. I've called on President Biden and Federal Reserve Chair Powell to lay out their clear plan to address inflation and rising prices that threaten American families. I've yet to get a straightforward or acceptable response. I've yet to hear them acknowledge this very real threat or propose a solution to protect families. So today, Senator Braun and I are making a simple request that the Biden administration share with the Senate all of its notes, memos, and reports regarding their discussions and plans to mitigate and prevent growing inflation. Inflation is a very real threat to the well-being of already struggling families, and the last thing American families need is to be misled by this administration. Right now, Democrats in Washington are living in a fantasy land where debt doesn't matter, spending has no consequences, inflation is impossible. But the reality is that inflation does have consequences. It is the duty of everyone here, especially the President of the United States, to be open and transparent with the American people about what's happening with inflation. Madam President, there is no reason the Biden administration should be hiding this information. Americans deserve to know the consequences of massive government spending, and they deserve leadership that will show some fiscal responsibility when it comes to their taxpayer dollars. I look forward to all my colleagues supporting this effort to increase transparency. Madam President, as if in the legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 185 submitted earlier today. I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President,
The senior senator from Ohio.
Madam President, reserving the right to object. Madam President, no serious economists across the ideological spectrum are concerned about inflation right now. No one is hiding information at the White House. I'm in meetings all the time with White House officials talking about this package. No one believed, first of all, no one's hiding information. No one believes what the junior senator from Florida is saying about this. Perhaps some millionaire senators want to make this into an issue, and I hear that over and over and over. But I talk to people like Jay Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve, nominated by President Trump for that position. He of course keeps his eye on these kinds of things, but he has expressed no strong concern about inflation. And we even know that when some experts have been concerned, they've been wrong. We saw what happened in 2008 after too many elites worried about inflation. What we really needed was to increase wages and get people back to work. The result from 2008 was a recovery that was too slow for most people, while so many of these big costs continue to rise. Our economy looks a whole lot better today than it did last year, but we can't compare where we are today with where we were last year. We were in the brink of a once-in-a-generation health and economic crisis this time last year. Millions of people, mostly low-wage workers, lost their job. Our economy ground to a halt as we tried to stop the spread of the virus. This year, we've made good progress with the American Rescue Plan, as the presiding officer from Wisconsin knows, getting shots in arms and money in pockets and kids back in school and people back to work. But our recovery is far from over. Just moments ago, Fed Chair Powell said that we're seeing some temporary upticks because things were so dire last year. We still have a long way to go. The bigger risk, Madam President, to the economy is not doing enough to raise workers' wages and to invest in the infrastructure that allows our economy to grow. We know corporate leaders, we know millionaire senators, we know people at the top have in many cases, done very, very well for this, but we know millions of workers, many of them hourly workers, have lost jobs. We know millions of workers, so-called essential workers. One essential worker said to me, works at a grocery store, I don't feel essential. Frankly, I feel expendable because they don't pay me much. They don't protect me at work. Those are the people we should be looking after. I want to raise wages. I want to bring down costs. That's exactly what the jobs plan and the family plan will do. Bring down healthcare costs, make childcare more affordable, create more housing people can afford, bring down energy bills, make getting to work cheaper and easier with better transit. These are the costs that have been rising and eating away at family budgets for decades. If my colleague from Florida is so concerned about the cost of living and raising a family, I hope he'll join me to allow Medicare to negotiate directly with drug companies to bring down prices for seniors. I hope he'll join us in investing in childcare to bring down the cost of childcare. I hope he'll join us as we work to create more housing, bringing down housing costs. I hope he'll join us to raise the minimum wage. My first speech on this floor 14 years ago, my first speech on this floor was to raise the minimum wage, and we did, and it hasn't been raised since. That's what the senator from Florida and the senator from Indiana can help us with. But we know, Madam President, most of the conservative elites in this country, most won't say out loud what this inflation alarmism was really about. They don't want to invest in the American people. They don't want to do anything to make Americans' hard work pay off. They'd rather try to scare people, can't spend this money because there might be inflation. They don't want us to do what too many have failed to do, to put money in people's pockets and raise wages and rebuild infrastructure. I'd ask my colleagues to listen to the words of a worker from West Virginia, Pamela Garrison, who testified at our first ever work listening session, our Dignity of Work session in the Banking and Housing Committee yesterday. She said, we're seeing corporations make billions every quarter in profit, but then when we ask for a minimum wage, we're told that no one will raise the cost of stuff. Oh, that'll cost jobs. Funny, corporate executives never seem to say they'll have to raise prices when they give themselves bonuses. It's just we'll have to raise prices if we incur the minimum wage. And this same Ms. Garrison also said, you know, they call me part of the working poor. The words working and poor shouldn't be in the same sentence. And she's right about that. Real expenses for most families have gone up for decades, along with corporate profits in the stock market. Executive compensation has exploded upward, and workers' wages haven't kept up. Executive compensation, productivity's up. Executive compensation's up. Profits are up. Workers' wages are flat. That's the problem. That's what we should be working on. Madam President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
The junior senator from Florida.
Madam President, the decision by my colleague to block this resolution is clearly disappointing. Let's remember what this was about. This was about transparency. They just blocked the Senate from requesting basic information that's going to help all Americans. And let's look at these numbers again. Just in the last 12 months, grocery prices are up 2.6%, household care is up 5.2%, baby care is up 7%, general merchandise up 7.1%. We're clearly seeing inflation. Senate Democrats have just objected to transparency. That means they're against getting the facts, against ensuring accountability, and against getting the American people the information they need to make smart decisions as prices keep rising. 87% of Americans are worried about the rising cost of goods. Apparently, so is the White House. So don't the American people deserve the same information about what is happening with the economy? Floridians deserve to know the truth about inflation, and so do the people of Ohio. Why does my colleague want to keep them in the dark? This administration is telling the American people one thing, but saying something else behind closed doors. That's wrong. The American people deserve the truth. Inflation is real. It's happening. It's hurting American families. It's time President Biden does something about it. And I'm extremely disappointed in my colleague whose action today is helping the president mislead the American people. I yield the floor.
The senior senator from Ohio.
Sent to address the House for 10 minutes. The House Senate for 10 minutes. I'm sorry, Senate for 10 minutes. Good point. Well, the presiding officer and I were in the House together, so, but that was like a long time ago. Madam
Without
President,
objection.
thank you. Today, Madam President, we mark Workers' Memorial Day when we honor and remember workers who've laid down their lives on the job. I've worn on my lapel, since I was in the House, Madam President, a pin depicting a canary in a bird cage given to me at a Workers' Memorial Day rally in Lorain, Ohio in the late 1990s. This pin depicts a canary going down in the mine. It suggests the mine worker taking a canary down in the mines. If the canary died from lack of oxygen or from toxic gas, the mine worker got out of the mines. He had no union strong enough to protect him and no government that cared enough to protect him in those days. To me, this pin represents the role of government to support the middle class and those who aspire to the middle class. It represents the progress we made in the society we continue to fight for every day here. We know the story. Coal miners took the canary down in the mines. Throughout the 20th century, we've worked to change that. We passed worker safety laws and overtime pay. We banned child labor. We passed clean air, safe drinking water laws. We enact Social Security and Medicare and workers' rights and women's rights and civil rights. But despite that progress over the last year, too many workers have felt a whole lot like those miners. They felt like they're on their own. A moment ago, I mentioned the grocery store worker in Cincinnati who said, "They tell me I'm essential, but I feel expendable." That grocery store worker and thousands of others have been on the front lines of this pandemic, risking their lives so Americans could keep food on their table and get their packages delivered. They're changing linens in hospitals and driving buses and stocking shelves in supermarkets. Then workers go home at night and are anxious that they might spread the virus and affect their family. We know that hundreds of thousands of workers have been exposed to the virus on the job. Thousands have died. It's hard to get an exact count of how many because the previous administration didn't bother to keep track. We know the food and commercial workers reported last summer that more than 16,000 grocery store workers have been exposed. More than 100 had died. We know those numbers keep going up. The National Nurses United has recorded at least 3,200 healthcare workers have died. In meatpacking plants, the toll has been horrific. Last summer, 16,000 workers had been affected. The vast majority of them Black and brown workers. More than 230 died. And yet all of last year, The Trump administration and too many large corporations failed to protect their workers. The corporate lawyers that ran the Labor Department from the top down refused to issue workplace safety requirements. Corporations ran a lot of feel-good TV ads saying thank you to essential workers, claiming these workers are the heart of their companies. But workers didn't ask for a PR campaign. They needed protections on the job. This Workers' Memorial Day today, we celebrate it every year. Remember the American workers who've lost their lives on the job from this virus, sometimes from gun violence, sometimes from workplace accidents. We honor them best by fighting to protect these workers and their fellow workers to make their hard work pay off. Yesterday in the Banking and Housing Committee, we held the committee's first ever listening session. It was purely a listening session. No senators got to ask questions. We just came to listen with workers from Ohio and around the country to hear how the financial system affects their jobs and their lives. They shared powerful stories about their work, about how companies and economic policies prevent their hard work from paying off. We heard from a distribution worker in Ashtabula, Ohio. He told us we rarely go a few weeks without an injury, largely because of the insane pace we work at. We have suggested that slowing the pace even just a little would improve safety and could save money. We were told injuries don't cost this company much money. We heard from a Wells Fargo call center worker who talked about how the bank misclassified her to avoid paying overtime. They put her on salary. They said she was management. They worked her more than 40 hours. They never paid her an overtime dollar. We heard from a full-time gig worker who works for multiple corporations like Uber and Instacart. He works full-time. He has zero benefits because these companies claim he's an independent contractor. We heard from a Michigan worker who lost her job when a private equity firm bought out her company. They laid off 3,100 workers in the Detroit area, and they pocketed the money. We heard from a worker in West Virginia who talked about working her whole life and never seeing that hard work pay off. She said, working poor, the term working poor should not be two words that go together. If you work hard, you should be able to get ahead in this country. If you love this country, you fight for the people that make it work. If even a global pandemic where America's workers have been on the front lines, if even that won't get corporations to rethink their business model that treats workers as expendable, it's time to stop letting them run the company. That's what the new Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee is all about. Wall Street had its chance. They failed. If corporate America won't deliver for its workers, then we have to create a better system centered on the dignity of work. That means safe workplaces. The Biden administration is taking steps toward finally issuing an OSHA emergency temporary standard. We went a whole year in the pandemic where the President of the United States simply refused, and the corporate lawyer that ran the Department of Labor simply refused to issue any standards on workplace safety. Think about that. Now it means laws and policies reward work, like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, which the Senator from New Hampshire is in this, the junior senator from New Hampshire is here and has been supportive of that. A strong overtime rule, ending misclassification that robs workers of their wages and their rights. It means a strong labor movement. Unions give people power in the job. People ought to have the option, if they choose, of joining a union, allowing them to join together to make their workplace safer. It's workers who make our economy successful. It's workers that allow corporations and Wall Street investors to rake in record profits. It's time for that hard work to pay off for all workers, no matter if you punch a clock or swipe a badge or work for salary or work for tips or take care of your parents or take care of your children. That work should be rewarded in this country. When you love this country, you fight for the people who make it work on Workers' Memorial Day and the other 364 days of the year. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time has expired. The question is on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Brasso. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Brown, Casey, Hassan, King, Leahy, Moran, Murray, Rosen, and Sass. Senators voting in the negative: Ernst, Grassley, and Lummis. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Ms. Collins, Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Marshall, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Rish, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Cotton, no. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith. Mrs. Hyde Smith, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Mis- Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Tuberville, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Warnock, Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Hirono, Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Braun, Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Ms. Duckworth, Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Hoven, Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Menendez, Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schatz, aye. Ms. Murkowski, Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Hawley, Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Langford, Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Padilla, Mr. Padilla, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, aye.
Set. Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 68, the nays are 26. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the president will be immediately notified of the Senate's action. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume legislative session. The clerk will read the title of the joint resolution for the third time.
Counter number 48, SJ Res 14, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code and so forth.
Okay. Mr. President,
The majority leader.
Mr. President, could we have order?
Can we have order,
Now,
please?
as we approach the 100-day mark of this new Congress, the Senate's about to take its first major step in fighting climate change. In a moment, the Senate will vote on reinstating common sense rules to reduce methane emissions. It'll be the first time the Senate Democratic majority has used the Congressional Review Act, and it's no mistake that we have chosen to use the law first and foremost on the subject of climate change. Under this Democratic majority, the Senate will be a place where we take decisive, ambitious, and effective action against climate change. Could we have order, Mr. President?
Order, please.
Of course, reducing methane emissions is not the only thing we need to do to fight climate change, but it's a very significant and large first step. Methane accounts for roughly a quarter of all the human-caused global warming that has transpired since the Industrial Revolution. Restoring these methane-reducing rules will be one of the most significant climate actions that the Senate has taken in more than a decade. I urge my colleagues to vote yes and commend Senators Heinrich, King, and Markey for their great work on this issue. Ask for the yeas and nays. Do I have to do that?
Is there a sufficient second? There is? There appears to be. The question is on passage of the joint resolution. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Young. No. Yep. Kids. Hi. Thank you. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Thanks. Yes. No. Thanks. Ms. Collins. I guess so. I don't see her. Thank you. Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Asa. Mr. Padilla. Yeah, okay. Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville. Yep, thank you. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Durbin, Gillibrand, Graham, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Kane, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Manchin, Menendez, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Portman, Reed, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Sinema, Tester, Warner, Warnock, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blackburn, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Gaines, Fisher, Hawley, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Langford, Lummis, Marshall, Rubio, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, and Young. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Grassley, no. Ms. Rosen, aye. I do, thanks. Ms. Murkowski? Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Merkley, aye. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mrs. Capito. Okay. Mrs. Capito, no. Sorry. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Romney, no. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no.
ready. I'll be on point. Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 52 and the nays are 42, and the joint resolution has passed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table. The senator from Delaware.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate resumes consideration of S 914 on Thursday, April 29th, the following amendments be reported by number, and that they be the only amendments in order to S 914. Rubio Scott, number 1471 as modified. Shaheen, number 1461. Kennedy, number 1469. And Lee, number 1472. Further, that at 11:30 a.m. on Thursday, April 29th, the Senate vote in relation to the amendments in the order listed, with 60 affirmative votes required for adoption of the Lee Amendment and passage of the bill. Further, that upon disposition of the amendments, amendment number 1460 as amended, if amended, be agreed to. The bill be considered read a third time, and at 1:45 p.m. the Senate vote on the passage of the bill as amended with 2 minutes for debate, equally divided prior to each vote. And finally, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, all with no intervening action or debate.
Can you modify it and clarify that it's 1:30
Yeah.
instead of 1:45?
A correction, here we go. The bill be considered, read a third time, not at 1:45, but at 1:30, the Senate vote on passage of the bill as amended.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the appointment at the chair appear separately in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
One moment, please. Let's go back to 1:45. Forget what I said about 1:30. May I ask unanimous consent? Lock it in at 1:45, as we said the first time.
Without
All right?
objection.
Good, good. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the appointment at the desk appears separately in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
I go. That the Senate proceed to the consideration of S-Res 186 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
SRES 186, honoring the humanitarian work of Aristides de Sousa Mendez and so forth.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to consideration of S. Res. 187 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
SRES 187, congratulating the University of Wisconsin Badgers on winning the 2021 National Collegiate Athletic Association Women's Ice Hockey Championship.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate recess until 8:25 p.m. today, and upon reconvening proceed as a body to the Hall of the House of Representatives for the joint session of Congress provided under the provisions of H. Con. Res. 30, and that upon the dissolution of the joint session, the Senate adjourn until 10 a.m. on Thursday, April 29th, 2021, that following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, and the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed, and that upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate resume consideration of calendar number 34, S 914, Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act of 2021 as provided under the previous order.
Without objection.
We will gather in the Senate chamber at 8:15 p.m. this evening to proceed as a body to the House of Representatives for President Joe Biden's address. Joe Biden, first Delaware and ever elected president of the United States. Madam President, there's no previous further business to come before the Senate. Madam President, I ask that it recess under the previous order.
The Senate stays in recess until 8:25 p.m.